Well, students, for the last 2 years, there is a word that you cannot escape, and that's the word epidemic. What is an epidemic? An epidemic is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease. A widespread occurrence of an infectious disease. And here, what the whole world has been dealing with is an epidemic called COVID. But what I want to share with you today is that there's a greater epidemic that we're experiencing. It's the epidemic of complaining, murmuring, grumbling. And I would even argue that it's just as contagious or even more contagious than COVID. We live in a world of complainers. Our world likes to complain about everything. Listen to the news. Listen to your friends. Listen to even sometimes your parents even at times. Sometimes even listen to me. I am guilty as well. We complain about the weather. We complain about the food. We complain about the time of day. We complain about our siblings. We complain about our parents. We complain about our children. We complain about a lot of things. It is so easy for us to focus in on the negative. And today I want to compare and contrast briefly this aspect of complaining versus what we're going to celebrate later this month, and that is Thanksgiving. It was October 3rd, 1863, that President Abraham Lincoln declared that the last Thursday of every November should be set aside for the nation to be a day of thanksgiving, and he actually went beyond that. It's not just a day of thanksgiving, it's a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father. Our culture has left that part out. But here at the end of this month, and I know you'll be thankful for this, you'll have a week off of school. But here at the end of the month, we have a day set aside to be thankful and to praise our good Father. But the challenge that we'll face from now until then, every day, every moment, and even on Thanksgiving, we might find the challenge and the temptation that we're going to face is complaining. If we're not careful, we'll complain about the turkey being too dry. Or in the midst of a week off, you'll be complaining, I'm bored. Because within our nature, we like to complain. And it's easy to complain. But when we complain, it's just as contagious or even more contagious as COVID. So today I want to look at a couple of passages of scriptures. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writing to the church at Corinth. And we don't have time to unpack it all. But 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says this. It's great to hear the turning of the pages. I love it. Paul says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert." Pause there for a minute. God had done this remarkable thing for the children of Israel. He had brought them up out of slavery from Egypt. Think through how that happened through the plagues. And then after he brought them up out of Egypt, they came to the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, if you would, but Sea of Reeds is a better translation. He comes to the Sea of Reeds, and what happens? He parts the waters so that they're able to walk across. So how is it that in the midst of they cross through the sea, they're into the wilderness in the desert, And he says God was not pleased with most of them. That's somewhat of a frightening thought. That here you had the whole nation, and it says God was not pleased with most of them. Now these things, in verse 6, occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. So Paul says to the church at Corinth, I want us to take a trip back in memory lane, to look back at the history of Israel and to see what happened with them and look at their examples so that we don't make the same mistakes. So that we don't become like what he just said, that God was not pleased with most of them. He doesn't want God to be not pleased with most of us. So he said we need to look back and learn from their story. Now, he highlights 4 things. I'm just going to talk about one of them. And that is down in verse 10. And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. We see this is probably a reference to Numbers 16, but I wanted to go back to the beginning of it in Exodus 16 instead. And this is a passage that Teddy read for us. In Exodus 16, verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Do you get it? We were in slavery. You brought us up out of slavery. Now we don't have the food that we liked. So, oh, Moses, why did you bring us out to this desert to die? Oh, I wish we could just go back to Egypt. Back in Egypt, while we were slaves, we had pots of meat. They were grumbling. They were murmuring. They were complaining. And notice what they said. They were complaining and saying they were complaining against Moses. Moses, you're the one who brought us out. Now, keep your finger there and go down to verse 8 and notice what Moses says. Moses also said, you will know that this is what the Lord, that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he heard your grumbling against him. There's a truth here that when we murmur, when we complain, there's a real truth that our murmuring and complaining is not against the person, it's against God. Is not God sovereign? Is he not the one who provides for us meat? And this is what Moses says. God's going to provide for you meat in the evenings and bread in the morning, and you'll have more than enough. But you have chosen to look back on your history and complain instead. I was reading a part of Augustine's Confessions, and he was talking about 3 parts of time, past, present, future. And he says in some ways there's really just one. When we're talking about the past time, it's really our present memory of the past. And then in the present, it's an awareness of what's going on in the present. And then when we talk about our future, we're talking about what are our expectations for the future. Let's unpack this with the Israelites. When it came to the Israelites, what did they do in the present? They were grumbling. Why? Because they looked back at the past with a certain way. They looked back at the past and said, Yahweh took us out of the comforts of Egypt. In fact, they didn't even say Yahweh. They said Moses took us out of the comforts of Egypt. We were comfortable there. That's how they remembered the past. They came to the present and said, we're miserable. And the future, their expectation of the future, we're going to die. The past, we were comfortable. The present, we're miserable. The future, we're going to die. What would have been a faithful response? The past, look at what Yahweh did for us. He delivered us by his powerful works. The future, while we may be hungry now, he provided for us in the past, so our expectation is, in faith, he will provide for us in the future. He'll provide for us. And then in the present, that would have been a response of faith. Instead, they chose a lack of faith. I think of Philippians 2:14, where Paul says, do all things without grumbling and arguing. Let me ask you, how many things do we do without grumbling and arguing? Oh, that was weak. One more time. How many things do we do without arguing? All things. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18, Paul says to give thanks in all things. What are we supposed to give thanks for? All things. We do all things without murmuring and complaining, and instead we give thanks in all things. That's a faithful response before the Lord. In fact, E.M. Bounds was a Methodist minister. E.M. Bounds said, gratitude and murmuring never abide in the same heart at the same time. Did you catch it? Gratitude, being thankful, and murmuring, being complaining, never abide in the same heart at the same time. You can't at the same time be thankful and complain. It doesn't work. So we have a choice day in and day out. How are we going to respond to life? And my challenge to you as we prepare our hearts for the holiday of Thanksgiving is to develop a heart of gratitude, to resist the temptation of complaining, which means you're going to have to look back at the past and see God's faithful hand. You're going to have to look forward with an expectation of faith of what God is going to do for you. And in the present, you live in faith. And you may say, is it even possible to live without complaining? How is that possible? Well, I'll conclude with this. Paul says in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 10, no temptation. Murmuring and complaining was one of the 4 temptations, one of the sins that he had talked about. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. The temptation to murmur or to complain is not unique to you. It's common for everybody. Everybody's had to deal with it. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. Students, my challenge for us this year in our first chapel, getting ready for Thanksgiving, is to be a campus, a student body that's committed to being grateful, that's committed to giving thanks, and that's committed to avoid murmuring and complaining for the glory of God. You guys ready to accept that challenge? All right. Let's do it year in and year out. Let's hold one another accountable. Let's help one another not to complain. And if you hear me complain, you can come up alongside of me and say, Mr. Halloran, are you complaining? Don't do it in front of everybody. But I give you my permission. If you hear me complaining, you can come up and you can even challenge me on that. Because my goal is to honor Christ. And if I'm not honoring Christ, then I deserve to be held accountable for it. We live in a community of believers, and we need one another. And I'm looking forward to growing with you throughout this year as we walk with the Lord. Let's pray.